Welcome, everybody. Welcome to today's seminar. I'm Mike Savage. I'm Professor of Sociology here at LSE. I also convene a team of research in the III on wealth, meats and tax justice. And Michael is research officer working in that team. He's our key resource and has done a brilliant job in helping me run the theme. So Michael's talk today is new changes in communication systems matters for its inequality. Michael, as well as being a research officer, he won a Leaving Early Career Fellowship. He's here for another 3 years. It's great to have him talking. I think from the perspective of the II, he has some really important skills around media communications. We know that communicating issues of inequality is a crucial issue. And Michael's really giving huge strength in allowing us to think about how questions of wealth and inequality are communicated, understood, and articulated. So we've also got people joining on Zoom. So if you are in the online audience, can you please keep yourself muted? Michael will speak for about half an hour, 40 minutes, and then there'll be some chance Q&A, both people in the room but also online. So with no further ado, I'll pass on to Michael.
Thanks, Mike. I'm just going to start a timer going. Okay, thank you for the introduction, and thanks also for the invitation to speak at the seminar series. I wanted to use... I wanted to use the time I have today to talk a bit about what I've been working on this year at the II. And as Mike said, my area is communication and inequality, especially wealth inequality, but also other kinds of economic inequality. And a personal interest of mine is in processes of digitalization and other change processes. So the title of the presentation is framed as a question. But, so I framed it as a question that do changes in communication matter to the politics of inequality? And it's probably not going to be too much of a surprise that my answer to that is yes. But I guess I want to use the next half an hour, 40 minutes to try and persuade you of that, if you're not persuaded already. So the talk is going to be structured in 3 parts. First, I'm going to talk a bit more about the motivation, why we should care potentially about these kind of changes. And then I'm actually going to try and maybe ambitiously talk about 2 studies I've been working on with some colleagues that hopefully complement one another on this overall theme. So firstly, a systematic literature review that we did in the run-up to a workshop we organised at the LSE earlier this month, actually, that some of you attended and presented at. And then secondly, a case study of discourse around the billionaire space race. So first up, briefly, to establish why might we care about communication and inequality. And in a nutshell, my answer would be that communication is what mediates this relationship between inequality and democracy, democratic responsiveness. So communication influences, for example, what information people have about inequality, how salient it is in people's minds, how accurate people's perceptions about inequality levels are. But maybe even more importantly, communication shapes how people might evaluate that inequality in the context of broader discursive systems. So when we think of discourses like meritocracy or egalitarianism, these are reinforced and reproduced through communication systems. And lastly, I would say that communication provides affordances for people that intervene in political systems. So that can be in more deliberative or more kind of contestatory ways. So by that, I mean, if we think of Piketty and the media blitz around his book, generating reasoned debate about inequality levels, or protest led by the Occupy movement, that each of these in different ways relied on communication technology and systems to create conflict and discussion about inequality. So much for communication and inequality. but the presentation is about changes. So I need to establish a little bit, what are those changes and why might they be important? So this is a bit of a selective tour, but I hope it will give some of the flavour. So firstly, one of the big changes that we see at the moment is decreasing centrality in legacy news outlets. So I've got a couple of graphs on the right here, which I think are pretty amazing. They're from the Reuters Digital News Report this year. So it shows that in the UK, for people who trust the news most of the time, since 2015 has gone from 51% to 33%. The people who are very interested in the news over the same time period has gone from 70% to 43%. That's a drop of 27 points of people who are very interested in the news in the UK. And there are lots of big intersecting explanations for why this might be the case. For example, platforms now play a really big role in mediating how people receive news. That has big implications for the business model of news organizations and the type of news that they produce. So now I think 3 times as many people get their news from social media than print, which is the reverse of the situation a decade ago. So you have the growth of not just social media competing with news, but also alternative news outlets that are partisan and operate with really different norms. So think of Breitbart on the right in the US or Novara Media on the left here in the UK. And I mean, another big trend is that sometimes legacy news isn't competing with other outlets, but people are just tuning out. So in the same report, they found that 41% of UK respondents actively try and avoid the news, at least some of the time, 41%. And this has big implications for how we traditionally understand media systems and the central role that news outlets play. But if we think of legacy news outlets as becoming less central, it's not that there's just a void in communication. And so one of the big other trends is increasing networked citizen communication. And this can be viewed in a really positive way. So around 2011, and the wave of protests there, social media was seen as a big agent of kind of democratizing change. And this gave rise in the field to the kind of connective action framework of Bennett and Segerberg, which has been very influential. And I think since then, focus has shifted a little bit more to the negative aspects of this network communication environment. So processes like polarization and misinformation as well. And so what do all of these changes amount to? And here I'd say in communications, public sphere theory is a kind of important macro theoretical framework to understand how communication and democracy relate to one another. And in the past 5 years, people who work on public sphere theory increasingly talk about public sphere dissonance, fragmentation, turbulence, and linking these changes to the very real risks and evidence of democratic backsliding that we see in different countries. So this is kind of the relatively grim view of communication, if you like, from within the communications field. But what I'm really interested in and what kind of motivated the studies I'm going to talk about is how communications and inequality studies as a kind of interdisciplinary field relate to one another. So these are my impressions, and I would really love to test these in the Q&A and see if you agree. But these were my starting motivating impressions. That people working on inequality are certainly interested in communication processes, and perhaps increasingly so. But often the motivation to go to study communication is to explain stability, legitimation of inequality, and reproduction of these social structures and economic structures. And I think that that also reflects some of the disciplinary tendencies of the main disciplines represented in the field, like economics and sociology, which, you know, people talk about. These disciplines are interested in patterns of adherence over time. And I think that this is just a really different approach to media and communications as a discipline in whatever discipline it might be, a kind of post-discipline or however you want to call it. Because in general, media and communications is interested in disruption and change and the transformations of the present. And I would argue also that when you go to International Communication Association conference or some of the top journals in the field, that economic inequality is rather underrepresented as a topic there. And this is not describing the field as a whole. Of course, there are people who work on this issue, but this is, I would stand by this as my impression of the kind of center of gravity of the communications field, which is much more interested in these processes like polarization and misinformation. So this is kind of the background motivation for what I'm working on. Are these impressions right? If they are, does it matter? Because I would say that if we find that changing communication systems does matter for the politics of inequality, then maybe both of these fields stand to benefit from mutual engagement. So this leads to study one. This was a systematic literature review, as I said, and I did this with a couple of colleagues, so Hendrik Tyner, David Schieferdecker, and Nora Weikfuss, who many of you will know as a good colleague at LSE. And so why did we do this literature review? Partly, we had this sense of things that might be missing from the literature, as I've just been talking about, in the field of communication about economic inequality. But I guess gathering evidence of absence is something that needs a more systematic approach to be convincing about. So this is why we turn to the systematic literature review approach. So I'll talk a little bit about how we went about it before I move on to the results. So we had kind of these 4 steps. And I should say, what do we imagine the scope of this literature to be? It's studies looking at communication about inequality. So this is to exclude a couple of related topics. We're not talking about inequality produced by communication technologies. So this would be stuff around digital divides and the like. Yes, that's an important distinction to make. So we had a seed list of sources that we knew from, including past reviews from Hendrik Tyner and Andrea Griswold especially. We did a wide search to kind of get new sources that we didn't know, and we had a set of keywords looking for articles that talked about, on the one hand, economic inequality in a range of different keyword iterations, and on the other hand, media and communications. I mean, this approach definitely has limitations, and I would be interested in talking about that more in the Q&A. But just to flag up front that there are definitely studies which deal substantively with our issues, but don't use the word inequality. And I think that that's a really important thing to bear in mind as a caveat for what I talk about next. The time frame was the past 20 years. So then we reviewed those sources, reduced it to those that just dealt substantively with our core topic, and did some snowball sampling. And then we coded, mixed of different variables like discipline, method, findings. So onto the summary of what we found with this literature review. So we did find that this body of research looking at communication about inequality is definitely increasing over time. So this graph on the right has just publications over time. The red is empirical work, the aqua is theoretical work. So you do see that there's this clear growth in recent years. That's mostly driven by empirical work. And it especially kicks off in this kind of post-2015 period. Just to give a bit of a flavour of what these studies are about, some of the key cases which recur over multiple studies are media coverage of Piketty, the Occupy movement and protests. There's a number of studies about the Bush era tax cuts and media framing and debate around that. And more recently, there are some studies emerging about pandemic and representations of inequality there. In terms of the disciplines, this is mostly sociology and political science and communication, as you might expect. And then a very distant tied third would be economics and cultural studies, which sort of diverge in maybe epistemological frameworks, you might say. So I think that, I mean, we can come back to this if people are interested. I do think it's interesting to think about why post-2015 might have seen this increase in interest. Is that just because of the fact of inequality? Is it because inequality as a term and a concept starts to be something that people coalesce around? I mean, this is obviously the same time that the III is founded. So there's kind of a momentum around inequality as a gravitating concept. And then there's some other things around data availability and methods, which I think are probably relevant too. So out of these studies then, what else can we say about them? Well, the bottom line out of this slide, if it's overwhelming, is that everyone still just looks at newspapers. That's the bottom line. So on the right, I've kind of plotted which methods people use, and this is on the x-axis. You have kind of content and discourse analysis on the right, kind of being very represented, and computational methods and experimental methods on the right, less relatively well represented. And then the kind of fill groups, the colors, are the different data sources that people go to. And the bottom line is, no matter what your method is, you are looking at newspapers and social media, that's the green, and social media, which is this kind of bluey aqua color, and digital news, the red, are practically non-existent. So this is kind of confirming what we expected to see about where these studies about communication tend to be looking. So I did want to, I mean, I thought it might be a bit strange to not talk a little bit about the actual findings and research questions of these studies. So I wanted to give a bit of a sense of what do these studies actually ask and what do they find? And this is a huge simplification. So I apologize for this, but it's just to give you a sense. The studies tended to ask a couple of questions repeatedly. Firstly, salience. What is the salience of inequality in news and in different countries over time? And it was really striking that there's just no clear consensus about that overall trajectory. And partly that's because measuring salience in communication is extremely sensitive to these measurement decisions. What are you tracking? Keywords. Is it income inequality? Is it just inequality? Are you looking at debates around a wealth tax or something else? And also where you're going to get the data from, which newspapers, what are their partisan kind of editorial slants, etc. Something that there does seem to be more of perhaps agreement about in our literature is framing, and this is a very dominant topic. So how do news organizations frame inequality? And even though there's definitely diversity in the findings, probably trying to summarize it in a nutshell, you might say that media frames often emphasize collective benefits of growth, even when it's unequal. So maybe this is trickle down as a shorthand, and simultaneously individualized responsibility, both for success and failure. So meritocracy maybe. And then there's a lot of studies that look at effects, generally find effects of news frames and media frames, but it's hard to condense that into one sentence. So you'll have to unfortunately read them. Okay, so this is sort of getting to the end of the first study. What does all of this tell us about the state of the communicating about inequality field? And I would summarize this as saying that firstly, conceptually, there is indeed this relative absence of the kind of systemic changes in communication that preoccupy other researchers in the communications field. So digitalization, as an example. As a side note, we really noted that anchoring these studies in the inequality construct might actually have a lot of associated implications for how the question and the analysis proceeds. So, for example, we noted a really overwhelming focus on policy, formal politics, and we wondered, for example, if we searched for, I don't know, communication and capitalism, or communication and austerity, or any other number of combinations, what would we have found? So that's useful when we gather around the idea of inequality. So empirically, I think I've made this point, diversity of methods, shared focus on newspapers. And we also noted that really the dominant mode of study is single country case studies, but from a very small pool of countries. Even noting our language limitations, so this is English and German academia, but really mostly UK, US and German speaking countries. So this is kind of, we say, methodological nationalism and all of the problems that come with that, but without the comparative leverage. So it's kind of the worst of both worlds. Okay, so if that is the sort of overview of what is happening in the field and what might be missing, I want to shift gear a bit to a different research approach and present this case study of the discourse around the billionaire space race. This is something that I also collaborated with, this time just with David Schieferdecker. And so what's the purpose of this research approach and talking about this here? Well, because I think if the literature review tells us what might be missing, it doesn't actually give us a clear sense of what that could be. It sort of looks back at what is already in the literature, but it's not very generative about, okay, what is this other form of digitalized hybrid media discourse that could be interesting and relevant to the politics of inequality? So this is why we picked this as a kind of heuristic case study to try and explore what the contours of that debate might be. So to the case itself. I mean, I do love this picture, which actually does come from a left-wing alternative news outlet in Canada. And so gives this, it's not just hopefully drawing you into the case, but it gives you a sense of how framing was actually happening in some outlets at the time. So the billionaire space race, when I'm talking about it as a media event that happened in 2021. So the space race has a long history. Even the space race, as it relates to these actors and companies, has a history over the 21st century. But in 2021, there was a very intense media storm around the launch of 3 flights by companies founded by some of the wealthiest people on the planet. So I'm not sure, did this register with people? Like, I'm interested to get a show of hands. Who kind of remembers this media event? Okay, good. This is reassuring to me. But so we are interested in asking, should we see this media event as part of inequality discourse or the politics of inequality? And if so, what does it say about that politics? A little bit on research design. So we collected 2 types of data. We got a full set of 240,000 tweets that related to certain keywords from the sadly departed Twitter researcher API. And also almost 200 legacy news articles from a mix of 5 different outlets. I wanted to give a couple of examples of what these documents are to give a sense of what we're working with. So up here is a Guardian op-ed with the very pleasing wordplay, "Let them eat space, Elon Musk, and a race to end world hunger." And then at the bottom is a kind of illustrative tweet, which gives a sense of how language is used in this different space. I think it's kind of gross. They put so much money into sending a billionaire into space for a little joyride as our entire country is struggling. Like the struggle with the question marks at the end there. But again, this kind of gives a sense of how the event was playing out in these spaces. So we have all of this data. How do we analyze it? We did a couple of things. Firstly, we did some very old-fashioned manual content analysis, where we took a sample of tweets and all of the news articles. We had a team of research assistants. We developed a code book primarily aimed at answering the question, does this article or tweet, is it about inequality? Is inequality present as a theme? And we coded some other variables, which I'm probably not going to talk about today. And we used word embeddings to kind of, in a more exploratory way, which I'll talk about on the next slide. So we're interested in asking questions, is inequality discourse present? If so, what characterizes it? We're also interested in any differences between news and Twitter. So let's check. Onto some key findings of the case study. Now, this is, it seems straightforward, but is actually important. First off, we did just a straight keyword search of inequality from all of these news articles and these tweets, because this is the dominant way of tracking inequality salience in political communication. So when we looked for how often people talk about inequality, there were 3% of news articles which talked about it and 0.2% of tweets. So this is important because any of those studies which track salience over time through keyword searches of inequality would totally miss this, especially on social media. But does that mean that it's not about inequality? Well, we would say no, because when we did our manual content analysis, which we met the intercoder reliability statistics, which was a nightmare, but we can talk about that as well. But we can stand by this and say, yes, we are reliably able to identify inequality being present as a theme. And we found that 54% of news articles and 43% of tweets included this to some extent as a theme. I can talk in the Q&A about the kind of counterintuitive ordering of that if you like, but it's actually a more dull answer than you'd expect about the different structure of the document. So I will go into it. Okay, so then we have this idea, people aren't mentioning inequality directly, but the texts are somehow about inequality. And this is where we try and use some exploratory investigation using the word embeddings method. So a couple of sentences on word embeddings. Feel free to micro sleep and tune back in when I come to the findings, but some people, it might be interesting or relevant. So word embeddings, mathematical representations of words, which when paired with these large language models like ChatGPT, or in this case, BERT, which is kind of a state-of-the-art large language model, they allow you to represent the difference between words semantically as the distance between vectors in some sort of multi-dimensional space. So why is that relevant here? Because we can imagine a vector in this multi-dimensional space that corresponds to inequality as a semantic concept, not as a word. And so this is what we did here. We used this great R package called Text. I can highly recommend it if people are interested, which used the labels, the manual labels that we had made, saying which texts were about inequality and which weren't, used that to basically project this vector, this line, where all of the words in the data set occur on this line from those which are least about inequality, according to our labels, to those which are most about inequality, according to our labels. And so this allows us to try and get at the answer a different way about what is this inequality discourse. Okay, so I'm done with the word embeddings method. You can tune back in if you departed. So this is where we come to the question, what does this inequality discourse look like on social media? And so there's some face validity here because all of the non-inequality language is about space. So you would assume, yeah, this is what the space enthusiasts are tweeting about, and they're not interested in it as a case study of inequality. But the language on the right is more emotional, more about moral evaluations, more effective, reactive to the specifics of the case. So wasting, suffering, they pay spending. And our argument here is that this illustrates the kind of discourse that is typical of this media event and potentially this different way of talking about inequality, which is more emotional, personalized, reactive, and has this plebiscitary flavor, which is very typical of social media publics, where it's about reacting to something and saying, is it good? Is it bad? So I do want to try and present a different element of the data set, which is about salience over time. And this takes advantage of the fact that we collected data over this 4-month period, and we can say when does attention peak and subside in the 2 different media. So here we've got a plot of the tweets per week and the news articles per week over this 4-month period. The different colors just talk about the degree of inequality salience. So the red is like highly salient, the yellow is low salience, but it's there, and blue is not, inequality is not present as a thing. So basically the contrast that I want to draw here is that you can see from the time series data of the tweets per week that there is one very intense peak of attention right at the start of the media event. And we do find that this, to some extent, is actually driving the news attention. So there's some analysis using vectorial regression that I haven't presented here because I kind of lost my nerve. It's not really my core methods toolkit. But just to reassure you that we've tried to statistically assess rather than just descriptively comparing the incidence over time. But I think it's fairly evident looking at the time series data that Twitter does have this one spike of attention and then that's it. And that's very different from the news attention, which has these 2 peaks. So the first peak, obviously around the launch of the different flights. So what's the second peak? Well, there's this week in October, a little over 2 years ago, where former Star Trek actor William Shatner became the oldest person to visit space on one of Bezos's flights. And also there was this really interesting dynamic where Prince William gave this interview criticizing the space race about the need to repair this planet, not try to find the next place to go and live. So it's easy to see from a more traditional media theory analysis why this combination is like catnip for legacy news. You know, it's got like strategic PR by someone rich and powerful. It's got elite conflict between, you know, Bezos and Prince William. And I mean, there's a royal, it's like, obviously, it's easy to understand why news responded to this. But it's perhaps more surprising that you don't see that corresponding peak in Twitter. And I think that this just reinforces some of what we might expect about digital discourse, which is that it's a lot more transient and ephemeral, that there are intense peaks and then those intense peaks move on to something else. And you can imagine people on Twitter when there's these stories about Prince William later on, people saying, oh, we talked about the space race. I've said all of the hilarious one-liners that I can think of about that. But it just goes to show that there are different dynamics between the different modes of communication. And that social media might be in some ways driving news attention, but also following its own more ephemeral, transient kind of attention dynamics. So, yeah, this is a good one, Tom. But this slide is sort of, you know, why do we care? Like, why do we care about the space race? in a sense, like tentative generalizations, although I will, of course, retreat from that if anyone criticizes me about the single case study approach. But basically, what are the potential implications of this kind of what we think of as a sort of spectacularized discourse around inequalities? And this is the change.org petition. 200,000 people signed this petition to not allow Jeff Bezos to return to Earth, which is, I mean, it's funny, but like, in what way? What is the joke that is being made here? So if we think about this as a kind of expression of spectacularized inequality discourse, what does that mean compared to how we traditionally understand, you know, people sitting around discussing the latest news report about Piketty's book? Well, maybe there's less attention to distributional questions. Maybe there's more preoccupation with the super rich, that it's more driven by affect and anti-elitism. And maybe it's reactive to events and transitory and ephemeral. I mean, what are the implications of this in terms of political outcomes? I mean, that's obviously very hard to predict. And so these sort of volatile dynamics can also produce results. But I think it's just important to say here that the dynamics and the consequences might be different to what we have come to be used to and predict from legacy news mediated discussions. And I also think that if we think of this sort of spectacularized inequality discourse, it's likely that this is sort of driven by trends which are certainly projected to continue. So digitalization, wealth concentration at the very top of the distribution, this kind of anti-elitist zeitgeist that we live in. I mean, all of these things are certainly not slowing down from my perception. So now I want to just spend a slide trying to relate the two studies together that I talked about today, because I do think that the kind of field literature review, the case study, they sort of complement each other in terms of research strategies. But I also think that these two studies speak to each other in a couple more specific ways, which I want to talk about here. So the literature review really reveals that there is a focus in the field on debates about inequality in news, in media systems driven by traditional news organizations. And the kind of classic, the paradigmatic case here is the Piketty media discussion. And I think what the billionaire space race shows is that really in the wild today, this kind of contestation about inequality can be totally detached from inequality as a construct and much more driven by spectacularization of the super rich. The literature review shows that there's this kind of theoretical and empirical centrality of newspapers in our research strategies in general. And the case study shows that, at least in some cases, there's very much a hybrid relationship between news and social media agendas, that they influence one another and yet they follow distinctive dynamics and trajectories. And then I think as well, this last point, that the literature review presumes that people are interested in long-term trends in discourse. That, I mean, I think that because of the success of these kind of arguments in economics in particular and sociology, that people talk about inequality over the 20th century. And I think that there is an impulse to replicate that kind of analysis and that time scale in communication. And I think that that's a little bit what we see in some of the scope of analysis in the communication about inequality field. And I think that the billionaire space race study shows that maybe as time goes on, there are not only transformations being made through these processes like digitalization, but also that discourse itself is increasingly ephemeral and event-based. And so that needs to be incorporated into our research designs. So, coming back to the original question, do changes in communication systems matter to the politics of inequality. And I think I would offer basically two different answers. One is to say that if we are interested in measurement and analysing discourse and communication, then absolutely, because we cannot just stay talking about newspapers and indexing and cascading activation models. I mean, it just doesn't represent the communication system as it exists now. I think that if we're asking, do these changes matter in explaining political outcomes in the politics of inequality? I mean, that's a much messier question. And I do think that there is this ambiguity between like taking the billionaire space race. Is it a good thing or an effective thing that 200,000 people expressed a view about inequality, communicated with one another, engaged in some sort of collective action? Or is it a bad thing, an ineffective thing, that was a fairly pointless expressive joke and totally detached from political processes, from any policy solutions? I think that's a very difficult question to answer, but something that I would argue, and I think the people from the workshop that we were together with earlier in the month would argue should be the subject of more research in the coming years. So thank you, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Michael. Lots of food for thought and issues to talk about. We'll have some questions on Zoom, but let's begin with some questions in the room. Amina?
Thank you, Michael. That was really interesting. Just to link it back to the politics of inequality. So there's always this talk about shifting or shaping narratives, right? So if what you're saying is that the legacy media is no longer kind of like an important site, where should these narratives be shifted, right? I mean, because also social media seems like very ephemeral. Is that worth the effort?
Well, okay, so this is always the trap that maybe I fell into, which is not to say that traditional news doesn't matter at all, and I think that it is still an important venue, but I think that the insight from the kind of political economy of the media crowd, which talks about increasing ownership concentration in some of the big news organizations and the sort of effect that has on editorial choices, I think that should be instructive for social movement organizations and activists in where to target their efforts. And so I think that, I mean, this is sort of like freelancing outside the specific object of research, but I would say organizing like outside of and around traditional news organizations, using more kind of relational modes of communication with core constituencies, yeah, is probably going to be more effective. And I just think it's striking that the kind of communication processes which seem to drive movement success in other parts of the political spectrum. So let's say polarization, radicalization, this kind of affective campaigning that the populist right uses to huge effect. You know, that you would imagine that this could be successful for the left as well, which is not an original argument. I mean,
yeah,
like I move and all the rest of it, but that would be my answer.
Right.
Thanks, Michael. That was really interesting. I have this is maybe an old question, but sort of how do you think about the challenge of, if you look at traditional news media, you have very sort of both in terms of like the unit of analysis, in terms of sort of geographic and temporal things, that's all quite set and comparable in terms of you've got a newspaper covering a given region and your consumer is one human, but that's also fuzzy when we're thinking about these new media sources, and how do you think about navigating that? And I had a really short question about Twitter, both sort of what's happening to Twitter now. Do we need to sort of, how do we use it as a data source? But then also the sort of thing of, are we as academics, because we all live our little academic lives on Twitter a bit, sort of, too preoccupied with that as some sort of representation of either discourse or the world out there, and sort of how should we maybe more critically think about Twitter as a data source?
Yeah. Well, so how to navigate the kind of comparability question with social media? I think that that's a really good question, and to some extent, like you can try and tie social media content and users to geographic locations to greater and lesser degrees of success. But it is sometimes possible, and not just using the kind of the very limited information that might be in user profiles, but also geo tagged information around using location information in posts or profiles. So, I mean, it is possible in some ways to locate social media discourse in geographic contexts, but I mean, it's also true that that will never result in the kind of neat national units, which exactly. So, I mean, I agree, but I also think that that is in fact the way that communication happens, that the same user will simultaneously engage with other users in a range of different countries. And so I think, you know, we have to be prepared to maybe just give up some ground on the comparability, the ideal conditions for comparison, in order to more closely reflect the conditions that communication's happening in. And then Twitter as a sort of source of data. Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right that it's an unrepresentative segment of users, and probably we are too interested in it because we are ourselves there. That having been said, I think that now that it's dying, we're really starting to see actually maybe it was a better proxy for digital debate than we really thought and appreciated, because, okay, let's take X off the table because the API is a mess and also the platform's a mess. So if we take that away and we as researchers are looking to analyze digital political communication, every answer is worse than Twitter was, I would say. Even though Twitter was far from perfect, every alternative is less representative of some kind of imagined digitally networked public sphere. So I think that that's a real problem that I don't know the answer to. I think that the only thing that you can do is think about which platform you're choosing, whether that's, you know, Facebook, Instagram, Reddit, whatever it might be, TikTok, and try and account for the ways that that is going to give you a very different and very selective slice of digital communication. Yeah.
Okay, you've got a couple of questions now, so Ellen first.
Thank you so much. You know that this interests me because, you know, so very interesting. I have a question for you more general about what you define as discourse, and following up on some of the other things on our obsession with text. Because actually that's also a big difference. And, you know, I also want to note that actually television isn't analyzed, but if we think about one of the biggest influences still in the media that most people consumed, it's actually television. So I wonder if you've kind of in your review of the literature, or when you were doing your analysis yourself, what do you think of other types of data that might be actually give a better or a more comprehensive impression? I'm talking about images, not one thing, which is very prominent on most social media, but also the idea of analyzing networks rather than keywords. So, for example, the people that were commenting in and linking it to inequality on Twitter at the start of the event, maybe they didn't comment on it when Prince William or something was talking about it, but these people might be talking about this kind of thing for different events that you wouldn't have picked up because of you were looking at, you know, kind of a vertical event instead of a horizontal with the network. So that was one question, and I wanted you to link that a little bit to the problem that we have in researching this in terms of the availability of what kind of data we have access to really understand the public sphere, because a lot of this data is managed by private companies. We don't have access to many of the things that are going on where people are actually sharing from different sources, talking about news in these kinds of circles. So I wondered if that was another thing that you maybe maybe reflect a little bit on in terms of, you know, the type of data that we're using, but also the type of data that's actually available for us to use.
Yes, absolutely. So I think that you're totally right that this was a fairly text-centric analysis. And I think that that is, I mean, that's been true of, if you go to the more sort of communication science region of the field, that's been true for some time, but it's definitely gotten more pronounced with computational methods, which are up until now a lot better at dealing with text than image, although there is maybe some catch-up happening. So, you know, I think that there's sort of a circular relationship between theory and methods there, that, you know, we analyze the things that we're able to analyze, and then we give those things greater conceptual centrality in the communication processes, because you know, wouldn't it be nice to imagine that we're looking at the things that matter? But I do think I'm very interested in images and visuals as part of the discourse around inequality. So some of you, you know Sarah Kerr.
Yes.
So Sarah and I are working separately on this project around visual framing of wealth inequality in different kinds of media. Yeah, I mean, I would say that it has again very distinctive dynamics. I mean, my basic response, if I can summarize it, would be the kind of classic improv response to these ideas about different domains of discourse and communication, where I'd be like, yes, and that. It should be yes, and television and images. And it should be, I mean, one of the big things that I am preoccupied with and trying to push for is more of a balanced focus between political communication and cultural communication as text, as objects. So, I mean, and I think that this ties very well into the kind of audience communication patterns, that people actually spend a lot more time consuming entertainment and cultural products than they do spend talking about the news. So, you know, we should study in a way that reflects those kind of priorities. But I would agree, yes, to images being part of discourse. It just requires a different set of methods at the moment. The networks point is a really interesting one. I think that you're right. I wouldn't be able to do that with the data set that I have, which goes exactly to your point, that the kind of data that we are able to access then shapes the kind of questions that we ask. But that's an important point, that the lack of a second peak might reflect original participants talking about it in a slightly different way. Okay.
Any questions on Zoom? You next.
Thank you, Michael. That was a very interesting talk. I just have a couple of suggestions for you. No questions at all, because I'm fully on board with what you've spoken about. And I also, so my thoughts are more about the latter half of your talk, about your findings from your wonderful, fun case study, which really accords with what we find in the economics literature. So I'm sure you're familiar with, there's a growing, if not quite large, literature now on the attitudes towards inequality and attitudes towards studies on poverty. And so this literature, in short, basically reveals effectively what you find here. some of the questions, for example, in the questionnaires or the surveys that are undertaken about how do you feel about inequality? Very direct. So give me on a scale of 0 to 10, where do you place yourself? And so it depends on how the question is posed to them. So if it's put in a positive way, for example, in the way you presented your billionaires case study, people say, yes, we don't like the rich being rich, we don't like the poor being poor. But if you ask them, if you present them with a negative term, such as inequality, how do you feel about inequality? They're not sure. So there are studies about perceptions, or how do people perceive inequality? So for example, if you ask them to place on a scale in terms of where your income levels are, where you are in an income distribution, they will actually put themselves far below where they actually belong. So they might be at the 80th percentile, but people actually place themselves somewhere around the 60 or the 65th percentile. So people perceive inequality as a negative thing, and therefore they don't like to talk about it, and which is exactly the purpose of your study, to see how underrepresented inequality is. I'll give you an example of how it works in the economics discipline. Of those of us who work on inequality, we find it really hard to get it published. The whole entire economics discipline is not interested in hearing about economic inequality or income inequality or consumption inequality, any kind of health inequalities. We're really underrepresented. So we do have a genuine problem. And I think what you've basically found out with your fantastic study really accords with the kind of percentages that we found in economics. And you might find it useful to sort of connect your work with, the findings that we've already found within economics. So that was just a suggestion for you.
Thank you.
Do you want to respond? Or?
No, I might talk to you afterwards.
Sure.
I have some more specific questions, so we don't need to involve everyone.
You got time for one more question.
Yeah, so it's similar because I am economist and I study poverty, inequality in incomes. So Gini index, development, human index. But this is the first time that I heard about the communication inequality. So it's the first time I never heard about that. So I couldn't understand the relation. So what is inequality discourse is like a linguistic view, or what is the relation with the economic inequality? So could you explain me please again?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I think maybe this ties a little bit into Ellen's point about kind of how we imagine discourse. So, I guess to put it simply, if economic inequality in this scheme is a sort of material set of facts about who has what, then communication and discourse about inequality is more the intersubjective construction of meaning around that distribution of who has what. So those things can correspond, but they don't have to. And that there is both a more straightforward relationship in terms of, okay, this idea about how do people understand where they are in the distribution? How do they picture a wealth distribution? But there is also a more elaborate form of how people construct meaning about inequality that connects them to narratives like meritocracy or egalitarianism or libertarianism or whatever it might be. So I think, I hope that this provides some answer, but that would be my perspective.
Great, thank you. It's 1:30, so I think we should finish now. Thank you so much, Michael. Really,